A racist police officer mistakenly believed that a black man relaxing in the park was engaging in criminal activity and arrested him without any justification. Shortly thereafter, he realized that the man he had arrested was an FBI agent, Jamal Davis. Jamal was seated on an aged bench in Riverside Park, basking in the late afternoon sunlight that cast a warm glow over the lush greenery. He flipped a page in his book, momentarily losing himself amidst the quiet rustling of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing. The park was one of his favorite retreats, a small oasis within the bustling city where he could clear his mind and temporarily escape the demands of his job. On this day, however, his peace was disrupted. Across the park, Officer Jack Carter patrolled the area, his vigilant eyes scanning the surroundings. Having walked this beat for over 2 decades, he felt he knew the city better than anyone else. When he spotted Jamal sitting alone on the bench, a familiar instinctive feeling stirred within him, a sensation of suspicion that he had come to trust over the years. Jamal's calm, composed demeanor seemed out of place to Jack. "Never seen him around here before," Jack muttered to himself, pausing to observe Jamal more closely. He felt a prickle of suspicion. There had been reports of a suspect with a general description that matched Jamal's, a vague and weak lead, but enough for Jack to act on. Jamal felt the unsettling weight of someone's stare and lifted his eyes from his book. He saw Officer Jack Carter standing some distance away, scrutinizing him with a look that was all too familiar to him. Jamal had encountered such situations before, and could easily interpret the officer's expression, prejudice thinly veiled as concern, a suspicion rooted solely in the color of his skin. Yet Jamal remained composed. He closed his book slowly, keeping his place with a finger, and met Jack's gaze directly. Jack's hand tightened around his baton as he observed Jamal's steady, fearless demeanor. It unnerved him. "Let's see what this guy's up to," Jack muttered under his breath as he began walking towards Jamal, his posture becoming more rigid with each step. He disliked Jamal's calm gaze, the absence of fear. It was unsettling. Jamal watched Jack approach, maintaining a neutral expression. He knew what was likely to unfold. He had seen it many times before. The atmosphere was charged, and Jamal understood that his response in the upcoming moments could shape the entire encounter. He wasn't in the mood for this today, yet he was determined not to give Jack any reason to escalate the situation further. "Good afternoon," Jack said as he reached the bench. His tone was polite, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, a subtle hint of suspicion that Jamal could detect. "Afternoon," Jamal responded, his voice calm and even. He kept his hands visible, resting them on the closed book in his lap. "What brings you out here today?" Jack asked, his gaze intently scanning Jamal's face, then flickering to the book. He was searching for anything that might justify the uneasy feeling inside him. "Just enjoying the park," Jamal replied. "It's a nice day." Jack nodded slowly, though his focus wasn't really on listening. He was more interested in what Jamal wasn't saying, trying to probe beneath the surface. "You from around here?" Jack inquired. Jamal offered a slight smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been around," he answered, a non-committal response that didn't sit well with Jack. The officer shifted his weight, his posture becoming more confrontational. "Mind if I see some ID?" Jack asked. Jamal's smile faded. This was the moment when the situation could potentially turn volatile. He knew his rights well. He wasn't required to show his ID just for sitting in a public park. But he also recognized that refusing could quickly escalate things. Nevertheless, he wasn't about to be intimidated. "Am I under arrest?" Jamal asked, his tone steady and deliberate. He met Jack's gaze firmly, unflinchingly. Jack bristled at the question, unsettled by Jamal's calmness and his refusal to be intimidated. It made Jack feel like he was losing control of the situation. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Jack shot back, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. Jamal took a slow, deep breath, maintaining a neutral expression. He disliked the direction the encounter was heading, but stood his ground. "I'm just sitting in a park," he said, his voice steady. "Is there a law against that?" Jack's patience was wearing thin. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he claimed, though even he realized how flimsy the excuse sounded. He stepped closer, attempting to loom over Jamal. Jamal didn't move. He held Jack's gaze, refusing to provide the reaction Jack was hoping for. "And what description is that?" Jamal asked quietly. Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't have a satisfactory answer, and he knew it, but admitting that would mean conceding control, a loss he wasn't prepared to accept. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID now." For a tense moment, the two men locked eyes, the air thick with tension. Jamal knew he could assert his rights and push back, but he also recognized that doing so could escalate the confrontation further. Opting to de-escalate for the moment, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. Jack watched every movement intently, his body tense as if coiled like a spring. When Jamal handed over his ID, Jack snatched it quickly, barely glancing at the name which meant nothing to him. His mind was already made up. "Stand up," Jack ordered, stepping back to give Jamal room. Jamal sighed inwardly, but complied, rising slowly from the bench. He kept his hands visible, careful not to give Jack any reason to feel threatened. "Turn around," Jack commanded as he pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Feeling a surge of frustration, Jamal suppressed it and turned around, allowing Jack to cuff him without resistance. He was aware of the bystanders nearby, feeling their eyes on him, but he remained composed, knowing that showing anger could only worsen the situation. As Jack tightened the cuffs around Jamal's wrists, a nagging feeling of doubt crept in, suggesting he might be making a mistake. Yet his pride and the momentum of his actions prevented him from reconsidering. Taking hold of Jamal's arm, Jack led him toward the patrol car parked nearby, his resolve firm despite the growing unease. Jamal remained silent as they walked, his thoughts already moving ahead to what would come next. He wasn't worried about himself. He knew his identity would soon be clear to the officer, but a deep weariness settled in, a tiredness that extended beyond this single incident. It was the exhaustion of continually proving himself, of knowing that despite all his achievements he was still viewed merely as another black man in the eyes of too many, like Officer Jack Carter. As they reached the patrol car, Jack opened the back door and ushered Jamal inside. The tension lingered palpably in the air. Settling into the seat, the cold metal of the handcuffs chafed against his wrists. Jamal gazed out the window as the car pulled away from the park, the trees blurring past. He pondered how this day, like so many before it, had spiraled so far off course. The patrol car's engine hummed quietly as Officer Jack Carter drove Jamal toward the precinct, the reality of the situation settling in with every mile they covered. Jack's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white as he mulled over the recent events. He didn't appreciate the way Jamal had looked at him back in the park, calm, unafraid, as if he held some secret knowledge. This gnawed at Jack, unsettling him and making him second-guess his instincts. Yet his pride prevented him from acknowledging any doubts. In the back seat, Jamal sat quietly, his hands cuffed behind him. Although the city streets blurred by, his attention wasn't on the passing scenery. He was preoccupied with what would happen upon their arrival at the precinct. Familiar with the system and aware of how quickly situations could escalate, he also understood the power and authority his position held. an authority of which Officer Carter was completely unaware. As they approached the precinct, Jack glanced at Jamal in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Jamal met Jack's gaze in the rearview mirror, his expression inscrutable. "I told you," he replied calmly. "I was just reading." Jack scoffed, his skepticism apparent. "A guy like you just sitting around reading. You expect me to believe that?" Jamal raised an eyebrow. "A guy like me," he echoed, his tone even but pointed. Jack hesitated, realizing his gaffe, but rather than retracting, he pressed on. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in a park," he retorted, trying to justify his actions. Jamal allowed a moment of silence to linger, letting the tension in the car build. When he spoke again, his voice was cool and controlled. "And what does someone like me look like, officer?" Jack didn't respond. He couldn't. He understood the implications of his words and how they sounded, but he wasn't prepared to acknowledge that to Jamal or even to himself. Instead, Jack focused on driving, his frustration growing as Jamal's composed demeanor continued to unnerve him. The car pulled into the precinct's parking lot, and Jack parked near the entrance. He got out first, then opened the back door and helped Jamal out, the cuffs still tight around Jamal's wrists. As they walked toward the building, Jack's thoughts raced. He needed to figure out what to do next. This wasn't how arrests were supposed to go. The suspect was meant to be scared, compliant, not calm and challenging him at every turn. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air. Officers filing reports, phones ringing, and the hum of ongoing conversations. Jack led Jamal through the main hall of the precinct, avoiding the curious glances from other officers. He wasn't ready to explain himself just yet, not until he was certain of his next move. They reached the booking area, and Jack signaled for Jamal to stand by the processing desk. Officer Thompson, a young man behind the desk, looked up, surprised to see Jack bringing someone in. "What's this about?" Thompson asked, his eyes shifting between Jamal and Jack. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Jack replied tersely. His tone clipped as he handed over Jamal's ID. He was still unwilling to admit that he didn't have a solid reason for the arrest. Thompson glanced at the ID, then back at Jamal. A flicker of recognition passed through his eyes, but he quickly masked it, nodding as he began typing into the computer. Jamal noted the brief hesitation, storing that detail in his mind. The recognition was subtle, but it was there. Someone in this precinct knew who he was. "Captain Simmons is in her office," Thompson said as he handed the ID back to Jack. "You'll need to take him to her." Jack stiffened slightly. Captain Angela Simmons was known for being tough but fair, a strict adherent to procedure. He hadn't planned on involving her so early in the process, but he didn't have a choice now. "All right," Jack said, his voice tight. He turned to Jamal, his grip firm on Jamal's arm. "Let's go." Jamal walked beside Jack, his expression still unreadable as they approached Captain Simmons' office. He could sense the tension in Jack, the uncertainty the officer was trying so hard to hide. It was the first crack in the armor, and Jamal noted it with quiet satisfaction. Jack knocked on the door, then opened it when he heard Captain Simmons' voice from inside. The office was neat and organized, with a large desk in the center and shelves lined with books and files. Captain Angela Simmons, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her paperwork as they entered. "Officer Carter," she said, her tone neutral. "What's this about?" Jack stepped forward, guiding Jamal into the room. "Caught this guy in the park, Captain. He was acting suspicious, wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Captain Simmons's gaze shifted to Jamal, and for a split second there was a flicker of recognition, just like Thompson had shown, but she quickly masked it, her expression turning professional. "Is that so?" she said, her voice even. Jamal met her eyes and saw the recognition there. He knew that Captain Simmons was aware of who he was, but she was playing it carefully, waiting to see how Jack would handle the situation. "That's right," Jack continued, oblivious to the silent exchange between Jamal and Simmons. "I brought him in for questioning." Captain Simmons nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I see. And did you have probable cause to arrest him?" Jack hesitated, feeling the ground shift beneath him. "He wouldn't cooperate, Captain," he repeated, though his voice sounded less certain this time. Captain Simmons leaned back in her chair, studying Jack carefully. "Officer Carter, why don't you step outside for a moment?" "I'd like to speak with Mr. Davis alone." Jack blinked, taken aback by the request, but Captain Simmons was firm. "Outside," she insisted, leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Jack released Jamal and stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Captain Simmons' demeanor shifted slightly, becoming less formal. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice calm, "I apologize for this misunderstanding." Jamal allowed himself a small smile. "No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job." Captain Simmons sighed, glancing at the closed door. "I'm aware of who you are, but I'd appreciate if we kept that under wraps for now. I need to handle this situation carefully." Jamal nodded. "Of course, Captain. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to make sure things are handled properly." "They will be," Captain Simmons assured him. "I'll speak with Officer Carter and deal with this appropriately. But I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you are?" Jamal's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. My identity shouldn't be the reason he decides to treat me with respect." Captain Simmons considered his words, then nodded in understanding. "You're right, it shouldn't matter, but unfortunately it does to some people." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. Finally, Captain Simmons stood up. "I'll call Officer Carter back in. We'll resolve this." Jamal nodded, watching as Captain Simmons moved to the door. The confrontation wasn't over, but he knew he now had the upper hand. The truth would come out soon enough, and Officer Carter would have to face the consequences of his actions. As Captain Simmons opened the door, Jack stepped back inside, his expression wary. He could sense that something had shifted but didn't know what. He glanced at Jamal, who stood calmly waiting. "Mr. Davis here is not the man you were looking for. You'll release him immediately," Captain Simmons stated firmly. Jack blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "What? But Captain—" "Immediately, officer," Captain Simmons repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. Jack hesitated, then finally reached for the keys to unlock Jamal's handcuffs. His hand shook slightly as he did so, the realization of his mistake beginning to dawn on him. As the cuffs clicked open, Jamal rubbed his wrists, giving Jack a measured look. "Thank you, officer," he said, his tone calm but carrying an undertone of finality. Jack swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "You're free to go," he muttered, stepping back. Jamal nodded and turned to Captain Simmons. "I'll be in touch, Captain," he said quietly. "There's still a lot to discuss." Captain Simmons nodded in return, understanding the weight behind his words. "I look forward to it, Mr. Davis." With that, Jamal walked out of the office, leaving Jack standing there with a sinking feeling in his gut. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Jack sat at his desk in the precinct, the tension in his body refusing to dissipate. He had barely been able to concentrate since Captain Simmons had released Jamal. The unease gnawed at him, deepened by the fact that he still didn't fully understand what had just happened. He knew he had made a mistake, but the full extent of it was still out of reach. The silence of the precinct around Jack was both comforting and unnerving, providing space for his thoughts to spiral. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approaching his desk snapped him out of his reverie. He looked up to see Captain Simmons walking toward him, her expression serious. Jack's stomach tightened. He knew this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Officer Carter, my office now," Captain Simmons said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Jack stood up immediately, trying to suppress the nervousness that was beginning to creep into his demeanor. He followed her to the office, each step feeling heavier than the last. Once inside, Captain Simmons closed the door behind him and gestured for him to sit. Jack hesitated for a moment before sitting down, feeling the tension in the room, the unspoken weight of what was coming. Captain Simmons moved behind her desk, took a deep breath, and then sat down across from him, her sharp eyes fixed on his. "Officer Carter," she began, her tone measured but stern, "do you have any idea who Jamal Davis is?" Jack shook his head, his confusion deepening. "No, Captain, just some guy in the park." Captain Simmons leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Jack's. "Jamal Davis isn't just some guy in the park. He's a special agent, one of their top agents, in fact." The words hit Jack like a physical blow, his eyes widening in shock, the implications of what he had done crashing down on him. "An FBI agent," Jack repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's right," Captain Simmons affirmed, her voice firm. "And more than that, he's highly respected within the Bureau. His arrest is going to have serious consequences, not just for you, but for this entire precinct." Jack's mind raced, trying to piece together what this meant. He had profiled and arrested an innocent man, a federal agent no less, based on nothing more than his own biased assumptions. The enormity of his mistake began to settle in, bringing with it a cold, creeping dread. "I didn't know, Captain," Jack said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem, Carter," Captain Simmons replied, her tone still firm. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. Your actions were based on assumptions and prejudices, not on any real evidence. You can't arrest someone just because they don't look like they belong in a park." Jack wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew Captain Simmons was right. He had let his biases guide his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. "What happens now?" Jack asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Captain Simmons sighed, leaning back in her chair. "For now, you're being placed on temporary leave while we investigate this incident. I've already spoken with the higher-ups, and they're not happy to say the least. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you could face disciplinary action up to and including termination." Jack's heart sank. Termination. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. He had been a cop for over 2 decades, and the thought of losing his career was almost too much to bear. But as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. "I understand, Captain," Jack finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain Simmons studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "I know this isn't easy to hear, Carter, but you need to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the people you serve. We can't afford to have officers who let their biases dictate their decisions." Jack nodded, though his mind was still reeling. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in, and with it came a flood of regret. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and protected the community. But now all of that was in jeopardy because of one careless, prejudiced decision. Captain Simmons stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "You're dismissed, Officer Carter. I'll notify you when the review is scheduled." Jack stood up as well, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Thank you, Captain," he mumbled before turning and walking out of the office. As he left the precinct, the familiar sights and sounds that had once brought him comfort now felt distant, almost alien. He walked to his car in a daze, the reality of his situation pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He had been a cop for so long that he didn't know who he was without the badge. The thought of losing it, of being branded as a failure, terrified him. But beneath the fear, there was something else, an unfamiliar sense of doubt for the first time. Jack was forced to confront the fact that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the upstanding officer he had always believed himself to be. Perhaps he had let his biases and prejudices guide his actions more than he was willing to admit. As he drove home, the city streets passing by in a blur, Jack couldn't shake the image of Jamal Davis's calm, unflinching gaze. It was a look that had unsettled him from the start, and now he understood why. Jamal had seen right through him, had known exactly what was happening even before Jack himself did. When Jack finally arrived home, he sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. The day's events played over and over in his mind, each repetition making the weight of his actions heavier. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that his life had just changed irrevocably. With a heavy sigh, Jack got out of the car and walked into his house. The silence of the empty rooms pressed in on him. He sank into a chair, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, regret, and uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to do next. Jack stood in the corridor outside the conference room, his heart pounding in his chest. The precinct was quieter than usual, the atmosphere heavy with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. The official review was about to begin, and Jack knew that every word he said in the next hour could determine the future of his career. He glanced at his reflection in the window across from him. The man staring back looked older, more worn than he had just days ago. Jack stood stiffly, a tension around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and forced himself to focus. This was his chance to explain, to justify his actions, though deep down he wasn't sure how to do that anymore. The door to the conference room opened, and Captain Simmons appeared, her expression unreadable. "We're ready for you, Officer Carter," she said, her voice steady. Jack nodded, swallowing hard as he followed her into the room. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The long table was lined with stern-faced officials, representatives from the precinct's Internal Affairs Division, a couple of high-ranking officers, and at the far end, a man in a suit whom Jack instantly recognized as Jamal Davis. Jamal's presence felt like a punch to the gut. Jack had hoped he wouldn't be there, that he wouldn't have to face him again. But there he was, sitting calmly, his eyes focused on Jack as if studying him. The look in those eyes was the same as before, calm, unflinching, but with an edge of quiet authority that made Jack feel small. Captain Simmons took her seat at the head of the table, motioning for Jack to sit in the chair opposite. He did so, trying to ignore the way his palms were sweating. The room was silent, the weight of judgment heavy in the air. "Officer Carter," Captain Simmons began, her tone formal. "This review is to determine the appropriateness of your actions during the arrest of Mr. Jamal Davis. We will go over the events leading up to the arrest, your conduct during the arrest, and the consequences that have followed. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" "Yes, Captain," Jack replied, his voice low but steady. He glanced briefly at Jamal, who was watching him intently, before returning his focus to Captain Simmons. "Good," Captain Simmons said, nodding. "Let's start with the incident report. According to your statement, you arrested Mr. Davis because you believed he was a suspect in a recent series of robberies. Is that correct? Jack nodded. Yes, Captain. I saw him in the park, and he matched the description we had. Tall, black male, early 40s. He was acting suspiciously, so I approached him. And what exactly was suspicious about his behavior? Captain Simmons asked, her tone neutral but probing. Jack hesitated, knowing that his answer here was crucial. He was alone, just sitting there, and when I asked for his ID, he was evasive. Evasive how? Captain Simmons pressed. He didn't want to show me his ID right away, Jack explained, though even as he said the words, they sounded weak to his own ears. He seemed like he was hiding something. Jamal's voice cut through the air, calm but firm. I was reading a book, Officer Carter. Not exactly the behavior of a criminal on the run. Jack flinched slightly at Jamal's words, but kept his focus on Captain Simmons. I was just doing my job, Captain. I was trying to protect the community. And did you find anything on Mr. Davis that would indicate he was involved in any criminal activity? Captain Simmons asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Jack shook his head. No, ma'am, he was clean. There was a pause, a heavy silence that filled the room as everyone processed what had been said. Then one of the internal affairs officers spoke up, his voice stern. Officer Carter, did it ever occur to you that Mr. Davis might have been telling the truth, that he wasn't the suspect you were looking for? Jack hesitated again, his mind racing for the right words. I was following protocol. We're trained to be cautious, to assume that someone might be dangerous until proven otherwise. Jack's throat tightened. He knew what they were getting at, and he knew there was no good answer. I didn't mean to profile him, he said, his voice faltering slightly. I was just doing my job. Jamal leaned forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on Jack. Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Carter, not to judge people based on their appearance. Jack met Jamal's eyes, and for a moment he felt a surge of defensiveness, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when he was wrong, and this was one of those times. Captain Simmons cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention back to her. Officer Carter, this review isn't just about what happened that day. It's about the mindset that led to your actions. We need to ensure that every officer in this precinct is upholding the values of fairness and justice. This isn't just about you. It's about the integrity of the entire police force. Jack felt a sinking feeling in his gut. He knew this wasn't just about whether or not he had made a mistake. It was about whether he was fit to continue wearing the badge. The realization hit him hard, and for a moment he struggled to find his voice. I understand, Captain, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. He stopped, the words choking in his throat. Captain Simmons softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. We all make mistakes, Carter, but it's how we deal with those mistakes that define us. You need to think very carefully about the kind of officer you want to be. There was another long pause, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone in the room. Then Jamal spoke again, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority. Captain Simmons, may I say something? Captain Simmons nodded. Of course, Mr. Davis. Jamal stood up, his presence commanding the attention of the room. He looked directly at Jack, his expression serious but not unkind. I understand that being a police officer is a difficult job. You are under constant pressure, and sometimes that pressure can lead to bad decisions. But we can't allow those bad decisions to go unchecked. This isn't just about holding Officer Carter accountable. It's about ensuring that something like this doesn't happen again. Jack listened, his heart heavy. He knew Jamal was right, But the truth of it was hard to swallow. He had spent his entire career believing he was doing the right thing, but now he was faced with the reality that his actions had caused harm, that his biases had blinded him to the truth. Jamal continued, his voice steady. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's career, but I am here to make sure that the next time an officer encounters someone like me, they think twice before making assumptions. This is an opportunity for change, and I hope that this precinct will take it seriously." Captain Simmons nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Davis. Your words are noted." Jamal sat down again, his gaze still on Jack. There was no malice in his eyes, but there was a firmness, a resolve that made it clear he wouldn't tolerate any further injustice. Captain Simmons looked at Jack, her tone softer, but still authoritative. "Officer Carter, you'll remain on temporary leave while we continue this review. I suggest you take this time to reflect on what's been said here today. We'll reconvene in a few days to discuss the next step." Jack nodded numbly, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "Yes, Captain," he said quietly. The meeting was adjourned, and as the officials began to file out of the room, Jack remained seated, his mind racing. He had come into this review hoping to defend himself, to justify his actions. But now all he could think about was how wrong he had been. The realization was like a cold, hard truth that he couldn't escape. As Jack stood up slowly, his movements heavy with the burden of his thoughts, he glanced at Jamal one last time. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no animosity in Jamal's gaze, just a quiet determination, a resolve to see justice done. Jack looked away, unable to hold Jamal's gaze any longer. He knew he had a lot to think about, a lot to come to terms with. As he walked out of the conference room, the weight of his actions and their consequences hung over him like a dark cloud. Captain Simmons sat in her office, staring at the stack of reports on her desk. Each piece of paper represented a fragment of the truth she was trying to piece together. The internal investigation into Jack Carter's conduct was underway, and it was her responsibility to ensure that every detail was thoroughly examined. She rubbed her temples, feeling the tension in her shoulders. The precinct had always prided itself on maintaining high standards, but this incident had shaken that foundation. Whatever the outcome, Simmons knew that the investigation would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Jack, but for the entire department. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the first report, the initial witness statements from the park. She had already read them multiple times, but each reread added weight to the growing evidence against Jack. The witnesses, all parkgoers present during the arrest, described the event with stark clarity. Their accounts were consistent. Jack had approached Jamal Davis with an assumption that he was a criminal, without hesitation, and without attempting to de-escalate. Simmons turned to the report of the body cam footage. She had watched it several times, each viewing more uncomfortable than the last. The footage was clear and unambiguous. Jack's voice, his tone, his body language reflected the assumptions he had made from the moment he saw Jamal. The aggression in his approach, the way he had disregarded Jamal's attempts to explain, the force he used during the arrest, it was all there, laid bare for anyone to see. A knock at the door pulled Captain Simmons from her thoughts. She looked up to see Detective Anderson, her second-in-command for the investigation, standing in the doorway. "I've got the last of the witness interviews," Anderson said, holding up a file. "And I've scheduled Jamal Davis for later this afternoon." "Thanks, Anderson," Captain Simmons replied, taking the file. "How's it looking?" Anderson sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Not good, Captain. Most of the witnesses are pretty clear about what they saw, and from what I can tell, the body cam footage backs them up." Simmons nodded grimly. "I was afraid of that." "Are we bringing Jack in for another round of questions?" Anderson asked. "Yeah," Simmons said, leaning back in her chair. "Let's see if he's ready to talk more openly about what happened." Anderson nodded and left the office, leaving Simmons alone with the file. She flipped it open and began reading the new witness statements. They were consistent with the others. Jack had acted aggressively from the start, and it was clear that Jamal had been trying to defuse the situation, but Jack hadn't listened. As Simmons finished reading, she felt a deep sense of unease. She had known Jack for years. He had always been a solid officer, but this incident had exposed a side of him that Simmons had never seen before. The hours passed slowly as Simmons continued to review the evidence. Finally, there was another knock at her door, and Anderson entered, followed by Jack. "Come in, Carter," Simmons said, keeping her voice neutral. Jack looked exhausted, his eyes dark with sleeplessness. He sat down across from Simmons, glancing nervously at Anderson, who took a seat beside him. "We're going to go over the events of that day again," Simmons said, leaning forward slightly. "I need you to be completely honest with us, Jack. This is your chance to explain your side of the story." Jack nodded, but his expression was tight. "I understand," he said. Captain Simmons glanced at Anderson, who started the questioning. "Jack, walk us through what was going through your mind when you first saw Jamal Davis in the park." Jack hesitated, his eyes shifting as he searched for the right words. "I saw a man who fit the description of the suspect we were looking for. It was a high-pressure situation, and I had to make a quick decision." "And what made you so sure he was the suspect?" Anderson pressed. "He matched the description," Jack repeated, his voice more defensive now. "We were looking for a black male around his height and build. He was acting suspiciously, like he was trying to hide something." Simmons could hear the strain in Jack's voice, the way he was grasping at justifications. "Jack, the witness statements and the body cam footage tell a different story. They show that Jamal Davis was cooperative, that he tried to explain who he was, but you didn't listen." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He was trying to throw me off, buy time. I was just following my training, Captain." "Your training," Simmons repeated, her tone sharp. "Jack, your training doesn't excuse racial profiling. It doesn't excuse the fact that you escalated a situation that didn't need to be escalated." Jack opened his mouth to respond, but Simmons held up a hand to stop him. "Look, Jack, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to find out the truth. The evidence we've gathered so far isn't in your favor. It shows that you made assumptions based on race, and that those assumptions led to an unjust arrest." There was a long silence as Jack processed Simmons' words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just trying to do my job." Simmons sighed. "I know, Jack, but intent doesn't change the impact of your actions. This isn't just about you. It's about what your actions represent and how they affect the people we're supposed to protect." Before Jack could respond, there was another knock at the door. Anderson stood and opened it, revealing Jamal Davis, who stepped into the room with a calm, composed demeanor. "Mr. Davis, thank you for coming in," Captain Simmons said, standing to shake Jamal's hand. Jamal nodded, his expression neutral. "Of course, Captain." Simmons motioned for Jamal to take a seat, then turned back to Jack. "Jack, we're going to hear from Mr. Davis now. I want you to listen carefully." Jack nodded, though he couldn't meet Jamal's eyes. Simmons gestured for Anderson to begin. "Mr. Davis, can you describe your encounter with Officer Carter from your perspective?" Anderson asked. Jamal's voice was steady. "I was at the park, enjoying my day off, when Officer Carter approached me. He was aggressive from the start, demanding to see my ID and questioning me like I was already guilty of something. I tried to explain that I was an FBI agent, that there must have been some mistake, but he didn't listen. He cuffed me, pushed me to the ground, and treated me like a criminal. Jack flinched at Jamal's words but remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Anderson continued, "Did you feel that Officer Carter's actions were influenced by your race?" Jamal didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. I could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at me, the assumptions he made before I even had a chance to speak. I've dealt with this kind of thing before, but it's different when it comes from someone who's supposed to protect and serve." Simmons could see the impact of Jamal's words on Jack. The way his shoulders slumped slightly, the way he seemed to shrink into himself. Jack said nothing. "Thank you, Mr. Davis," Captain Simmons said. "I appreciate your honesty." Jamal nodded, then stood to leave. As he reached the door, he paused and turned back to Jack. "I don't hold any personal grudges, Officer Carter, but I hope you can take this as an opportunity to learn and understand the impact of your actions. It's not just about what you intended. It's about how those intentions play out in the real world." With that, Jamal left the room, leaving a heavy silence. Simmons looked at Jack, who was still staring at the table. "Jack, this investigation isn't just about finding out what happened. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again. We have to do better, for the people we serve and for ourselves." Jack nodded slowly, but there was no fight left in him. The weight of the evidence, the words of Jamal Davis, and the reality of his actions were all starting to sink in. Whether or not he was ready to fully confront that truth remained to be seen. "Take the rest of the day, Jack," Simmons said quietly. "We'll reconvene tomorrow." Jack stood, his movements stiff, and left the office without another word. As the door closed behind him, Simmons felt a heavy sense of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This investigation was just the beginning. There was still much work to be done, both within the department and beyond. But for now, all she could do was continue to piece together the truth and hope that it would lead to real change. Captain Simmons sat in her office, the final report of the investigation lying closed on her desk. The conclusion was clear, and the decision had been made, but that didn't make the task ahead any easier. She glanced at the clock, knowing Jamal Davis would be arriving soon. The conversation they were about to have felt like a turning point, not just for Jack Carter, but for the entire department. A soft knock at the door signaled Jamal's arrival. Simmons stood and smoothed the front of her uniform, preparing herself for the conversation. "Come in," she called. The door opened and Jamal entered, his expression calm and composed as usual. He gave Simmons a polite nod before taking a seat across from her. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Davis," Simmons began, sitting down as well. "Of course," Jamal replied, his tone steady. "I assume the investigation is complete." "It is," Simmons confirmed, leaning forward slightly. "After reviewing all the evidence, the witness statements, the body cam footage, and the interviews, it's been decided that Officer Carter will be terminated from his position." Jamal nodded slowly, taking in the information. "I appreciate the thoroughness of the investigation, Captain, but I have to ask, do you believe this decision will lead to real change within the department?" Simmons paused, choosing her words carefully. "I believe it's a step in the right direction. Jack Carter's actions were unacceptable, and his termination sends a clear message that racial profiling and the abuse of power will not be tolerated. But I also know that firing one officer isn't enough to address the deeper issues at play." Jamal's gaze remained steady as he replied, "You're right, this is about more than one officer. It's about the culture within the department, the training officers receive, and the biases that can influence their decisions in the field. If we don't address those underlying factors, incidents like this will keep happening." Simmons nodded, appreciating Jamal's candor. "I agree. This incident has brought to light the need for systemic change, and I'm committed to making that happen. We're already working on revising our training programs to include more comprehensive education on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. We're also planning to implement more rigorous oversight and accountability measures. That's a good start, Jamal said, a hint of approval in his voice. But it's going to take more than just policy changes. It's about changing the mindset of the officers, helping them understand the impact their actions have on the communities they serve. That's not something that can be achieved overnight. I know, Simmons admitted. It's going to be a long and difficult process, but it's necessary if we want to rebuild trust and ensure that what happened to you doesn't happen to someone else. Jamal leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I've been in law enforcement long enough to know that change doesn't come easy, especially when it involves confronting uncomfortable truths. But I'm willing to work with you, Captain, to help make those changes. This isn't just about me, it's about creating a safer, more just system for everyone. Simmons felt a surge of respect for Jamal. Despite everything he had been through, he was still willing to engage, to push for the reforms that were so desperately needed. I appreciate that, Mr. Davis, Simmons said sincerely. Your experience and insight will be invaluable as we move forward, and I want you to know that your voice will be heard. Jamal nodded. Thank you, Captain. I'm not looking for any special treatment. I just want to make sure that this department becomes the best version of itself. That's what the community deserves, and that's what the officers deserve too. Simmons couldn't agree more. You're right, and I promise you, we're committed to making that happen. The room fell into a comfortable silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on the weight of the conversation. The decision to fire Jack Carter was just the beginning. The real work lay ahead in the reforms and the cultural shift that would be necessary to prevent future injustices. As Jamal stood to leave, Simmons rose as well, extending her hand. Thank you again, Mr. Davis. I look forward to working with you. Jamal shook her hand firmly. Likewise, Captain. Let's make sure this is a turning point, not just a momentary reaction. With that, Jamal left the office, leaving Simmons alone with her thoughts. Captain Simmons glanced at the closed investigation report on her desk one last time before turning her attention to the future. The decision had been made, but now it was up to her and the department to ensure that it led to real and lasting change. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with resistance and challenges, but Simmons was ready. This was about more than just one officer, more than just one incident. It was about doing what was right, no matter how hard that might be. With renewed determination, Simmons reached for her phone and began making the calls that would set the reforms in motion. The department needed to evolve, and she would do everything in her power to make sure it did. The morning was overcast as Jamal Davis walked up the steps of the precinct. The air felt heavy, like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, but charged with a sense of anticipation. The changes Captain Simmons had promised were starting to take shape, but there was still a long road ahead. As Jamal entered the building, he noticed the subtle shifts in the environment. A new bulletin board near the entrance displayed information about upcoming workshops on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. Officers moved through the halls with a different energy. Their conversations were quieter, more serious. The events of the past few weeks had left an indelible mark on everyone. Jamal made his way to Captain Simmons' office, nodding politely to the officers he passed. Some returned the gesture with respect, while others avoided his gaze, still grappling with the fallout of what had happened. When he reached Simmons' office, he found the door slightly ajar. He knocked softly before pushing it open. "Come in," Simmons called, looking up from her desk. Jamal stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Simmons rose from her chair and offered him a warm smile. "Good to see you again, Mr. Davis." "Likewise, Captain," Jamal replied, taking a seat across from her. "I wanted to see how things were progressing." Simmons nodded, her expression serious but determined. "We're making headway. The new training programs are being rolled out, and we're implementing stricter oversight to ensure accountability. It's a start, but there's still a lot of work to be done." Jamal appreciated her honesty. "Change takes time, but it's encouraging to see the steps you're taking. How's the department handling it?" "There's been some pushback," Simmons admitted. "Not everyone is on board, but most of the officers understand that these changes are necessary. We've had a few difficult conversations, but I'm hopeful that we're moving in the right direction." Jamal leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent. "That's good to hear. It's important to keep the momentum going, to make sure these changes are more than just a response to one incident." "Agreed," Simmons said. "This is about building a new foundation for how we operate, one that's rooted in fairness and respect for everyone we serve." As they spoke, the door to the office opened again, and Jack Carter stepped inside. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He was dressed in plain clothes, a cardboard box in his hands. It was clear he was here to collect the last of his belongings. "Captain," Jack greeted Simmons stiffly, avoiding eye contact with Jamal. "Jack," Simmons replied, her tone neutral. For a moment the room was silent, the air thick with unresolved tension. Jack finally turned to Jamal, his expression tight. "Mr. Davis, I just wanted to say I didn't mean for things to turn out like this." Jamal met his gaze calmly. "It's not about what you meant, Officer Carter. It's about what you did and the impact it had. Intentions don't excuse actions." Jack flinched at the bluntness of Jamal's words but nodded, accepting the truth. "I know. I don't know how to fix this." "You can start by acknowledging the problem," Jamal said evenly. "We all have biases, but it's how we deal with them that matters. You have the opportunity to learn from this, to become a better person because of it." Jack's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He turned back to Simmons, his voice barely above a whisper. "I suppose this is it then?" Simmons nodded, her expression softening. "It doesn't have to be the end, Jack. You can still choose to grow from this, to make changes in your life, but that's up to you." Jack stood there for a moment as if considering her words before giving a brief nod. "I'll think about it." He paused, then added, With that, Jack turned and left the office, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Simmons and Jamal watched him go, both lost in their thoughts. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Jamal asked after a moment. Simmons sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I hope so, but it's out of our hands now. All we can do is focus on the work in front of us." Jamal nodded in agreement. "And there's plenty of that." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Finally, Jamal stood, extending his hand to Simmons. "Thank you for everything, Captain. I appreciate your commitment to making things right." Simmons shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Davis. Your involvement has been invaluable. We're in this together." With that, Jamal turned and left the office, making his way through the precinct one last time. As he walked down the halls, he could feel the eyes of the officers on him, some curious, some contemplative. He knew that change wouldn't come easily, but he also knew that it was necessary. The events of the past few weeks had opened a door, and it was up to all of them to walk through it. As Jamal stepped out into the cool morning air, he took a deep breath, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. The path ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to continue the fight for justice. This was just the beginning, and he was determined to see it through. With renewed determination, Jamal walked away from the precinct, his mind already turning to the next steps in his work. There was so much more to be done, but for the first time in a long while he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was coming, and he would be there to help guide it every step of the way.